Have you ever watched someone be humiliated in front of dozens of strangers, not because they did anything wrong, but simply because they didn't look like they belonged? Have you ever seen dignity hold its ground, quietly, powerfully, until an entire system had no choice but to change? This isn't a story about viral videos. It's not even about racism in first class. It's about one man, a man who chose to stand tall when everything around him told him to shrink. And what he did next, it didn't just change a flight. It changed a company, a culture, and maybe a future. Because sometimes the most powerful voice in the room is the one that says no. Not this time. In today's story, you'll follow Captain Marcus Thompson, a seasoned black pilot with over 3,000 flights under his belt. A man who had spent decades swallowing prejudice in silence until one flight to London, when a glass of champagne shattered everything. You'll witness the moment a wealthy passenger demanded his removal from first class, and what she didn't know was that the man she tried to erase was about to hold her company's future in the palm of his hand. And that was just the beginning. Because what started with insult would soon uncover a $120 million corporate fraud, spark a federal investigation, and ignite a movement inside an entire airline. It was a quiet Tuesday morning in Atlanta. The kind of morning where the sky feels heavier than usual and the roads still remember the hush of the night. Captain Marcus Thompson was already up his uniform, pressed his coffee, brewing, his hands moving with the practiced grace of a man who'd lived a life of precision and quiet pride. 15 years flying for Atlantic Airways. Not a single incident. Not a single complaint. Not a single person questioning his capability until today. His daughter's MIT acceptance letter was still tacked to the bulletin board. His wife Sharon stirred gently in their bed, used to the rhythm of takeoffs and goodbyes before sunrise. And as Marcus closed the door behind him, he had no idea that today he wouldn't just be flying a plane. He'd be navigating a storm much bigger than weather. A storm with no radar, no checklist, no altitude high enough to escape from what was coming. It was supposed to be just another flight. A long-haul leg from Atlanta to London. A deadhead assignment for Captain Marcus Thompson, just a repositioning flight before he'd pilot the return from Paris. He wasn't on duty. He wasn't even wearing his full hat and wings. He was simply a passenger, in seat 2A, first class. But sometime, a single moment can slice through the routine and reveal everything that's been bubbling beneath the surface. The champagne flute hit the cabin floor with a sharp, crystalline crack. Bubbly gold spilled across the aisle and splashed against Marcus's polished shoes. He didn't move, not at first, and neither did the others. The entire cabin held its breath. "I will not sit next to him," she had said. Her name was Patricia Whitmore, blonde, mid-50s. Pearls, the kind of presence that filled a space with certainty and assumption. "I paid $42,000 for this seat," she added, her finger pointing like a verdict. "Not next to him, not for 5 hours. Not in first class, not ever." No one said a word. Not the elderly man in 2B who lowered his newspaper. Not the tech executive in 3A who paused his laptop mid-keystroke. Not even the flight attendant Jennifer who stood frozen between professionalism and disbelief. Because the shock wasn't just in what she said, but in the ease with which she said it. Not in a whisper, not in a moment of confusion, but with the deliberate confidence of someone who had always been able to rearrange the world around her. And that's what made the glass so dangerous. Not just that it shattered, but what it revealed. Marcus didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply stood. At 6'2", with decades of quiet strength behind him, he rose with the kind of dignity that doesn't need to prove itself. "I understand you have concerns," he said gently. "If my presence makes you uncomfortable, I'll speak to the gate agent about a change." It was the kind of response he had learned over years of being mistaken for the porter, the valet, the help. Years of "yes ma'am" and "no sir," and smiling while being questioned for just existing where he didn't look like he belonged. And then the word that made the whole cabin flinch. "Boy." It slipped out of her mouth like muscle memory. "Clean it up, boy." The insult wasn't in the volume, it was in the certainty. That he didn't belong there. That his presence was an error, a mistake in her otherwise curated world. And yet, Marcus didn't flinch. He bent down, picked up a shard of broken glass, and said calmly, "You're right. I will clean this up. That's what we do, isn't it? clean up messes, make sure everyone gets where they're going safely. What Patricia didn't know, what the entire cabin didn't yet realize, was that the man she just insulted would within 72 hours hold the future of the entire airline in his hands. And that's the thing about dignity. It doesn't shout. It doesn't beg. It doesn't need a stage. It just stands up and doesn't sit down. Sometimes what gets shattered isn't just glass. It's illusion. It's hierarchy. It's the comfortable lie that prejudice only lives in whispers. But once it's broken, you can't unsee it. And you can't pretend it didn't happen. Because when a glass breaks, everyone hears it. And yet what came next, that's what no one saw coming. Because this wasn't the end of a moment. It was the beginning of something far bigger. Something that would challenge the very question, who gets to belong in first class? And who decides that anyway, let's go there? Marcus Thompson had worn that uniform for 15 years. The stripes on his shoulders weren't just stitched with thread. They were sewn with early mornings, missed birthdays, red-eye landings, and the weight of unspoken expectations. And yet as he stood there in 2A champagne, soaking his slacks, surrounded by silence, you could almost hear the real question behind Patricia Whitmore's outrage. Who let him in here, not just into first class, but into this space, into success, into visibility, into the places reserved for the people who look like they belong. This wasn't about one woman. It was about the stories we've all been told, the images we've absorbed without even realizing it. Close your eyes and picture a pilot. Be honest. What does he look like? For most people, that mental snapshot still defaults to a white man, clean-shaven, mid-40s, probably named Tom or Steve. It's not malicious. It's not even always conscious, but it's there. In the movies, in the training manuals, in the commercials, in who we trust when we step onto a plane. And so when someone like Marcus enters that frame, it disrupts the narrative. Not because he's not qualified, but because he doesn't fit the template. This isn't just a first-class problem. Ask any black doctor who's had patients ask for a real physician, or any Latina attorney who's been mistaken for the court reporter, or any Asian American CEO who's been told you don't look like a boss. The spaces we earn through sweat, study, sacrifice are often the same spaces where we're still questioned, still tested, still asked to prove over and over again that we belong. Marcus had learned this early, back when he was still in flight school. He remembered the way one instructor double-checked his simulator scores, not because they seemed too low, but because they were too high. He remembered being asked more than once if he was on a sports scholarship, even though flight school doesn't have sports scholarships. And later as a junior pilot, he remembered the passengers who refused to look him in the eye during the pre-flight announcement, the businessmen who joked about hoping he knows where he's going, the subtle glances, the nervous chuckles, the momentary tension when someone realized who was flying the plane. But still he flew. He flew with professionalism. He flew with pride. He flew because he knew every time a child saw him in that cockpit, another story was being rewritten. They're supposed to equalize. They say, this person is trained, trusted, tasked with your safety. But some people like Marcus still have to wear more than the uniform. They have to wear patience, poise, restraint. They have to carry the invisible weight of centuries of doubt, of exclusion, of not yet and not you. Representation doesn't just matter because it inspires. It matters because it interrupts. It interrupts assumptions. It rewrites expectations. It plants a new image in the minds of the next generation, one where a black pilot in first class doesn't raise eyebrows. It raises hope. And as Marcus sat back down in 2A, dignity intact, glass shards still in hand, he knew this wasn't the end of a confrontation. It was the start of a conversation, one that would soon leave the cabin and reach the boardroom. Because sometimes, belonging isn't about fitting in. It's about challenging the room until the room changes shape. Marcus Thompson had flown over 3,000 commercial flights. From the snow-dusted tarmacs of Chicago to the shimmering runways of Dubai, he'd guided hundreds of thousands of passengers safely across oceans and time zones. And yet none of those landings, none of those logged hours, none of those commendations could stop what had happened in seat 2A. Because no matter how many times you prove yourself, some people still need to be reminded your dignity is not up for debate. You see, Marcus wasn't new to moments like this. They'd just never been quite so public. He'd had the private ones, the hotel clerk who asked if he was there to deliver room service, the passenger who handed him their carry-on, assuming he worked ground crew, the senior executive who paused confused when Marcus introduced himself as the captain. Every time he chose to take the high road. Smile, redirect, move forward. Not because it didn't hurt, but because he had a family to care for. Because there were bills to pay, a mortgage to cover, a daughter with Ivy League dreams and tuition to match. And truthfully, because swallowing indignity had become muscle memory, a quiet form of survival. But this time was different. It wasn't just the slur. It wasn't just the broken glass. It wasn't even about Patricia Whitmore. It was about timing. Because some moments arrive after years of build-up, quiet injustices stacking like pages in a file until the folder can't hold anymore. For Marcus, this was that moment. He didn't yell, didn't curse, didn't make a scene. But what he did do was choose not to shrink. He stood tall, he spoke plainly, and with the calm steadiness of a man who knew his own worth, he refused to apologize for being there. That might not sound like defiance, but in a world that often expects silence from people like him, it absolutely was. You know, sometimes we imagine defiance as loud, a fist raised, a voice shouted, a door slammed. But often the most radical act is choosing to stay seated, to stay visible, to stay present. That's what Marcus did. He could have asked to move. He could have taken the settlement. He could have let it pass again. But this time he stayed. Not because it was comfortable, but because it was necessary. There comes a time when silence becomes complicity, and grace, while powerful, must sometimes make room for courage. Marcus wasn't trying to start a movement. He was just tired of making himself smaller so others could stay comfortable. And when that glass broke, so did the old pattern. Of course, Marcus had no idea what was coming next. He didn't know that video of the incident was already circling social media. Didn't know that people from Atlanta to London would soon be chanting his name. Didn't know that a quiet moment of dignity would shake the foundations of an airline's leadership or expose something far darker behind the scenes. He only knew this. He had flown thousands of flights. But this was the one that would define him. It started with a quiet ping. Somewhere in row 3, a teenager had lifted their phone. No flash, no announcement, just instinct. By the time Marcus sat back down, the video was already uploaded, and within an hour it was everywhere. At first it was shared quietly, among friends, in group chats, a video titled something like "White Passenger Goes Off on Black Pilot in First Class. Watch what he does." But soon it picked up steam. Retweets, duets, commentary, outrage poured in. Some saw it as justice. Some called it grace. Some just couldn't believe a man could stay that calm after being humiliated that publicly. Captain Dignity started trending. And just like that, Marcus Thompson wasn't just a pilot. He was a symbol. But symbols come with a price. The first call came from his daughter. "Dad, I saw the video. Everyone on campus is talking about it." Her voice shook between admiration and fear. Then came the reporters, the local paper, then CNN, then a morning show wanting an interview, in uniform if possible. Marcus didn't know what to say. He hadn't planned any of this. He'd spent 15 years avoiding the spotlight, choosing professionalism over protest. Now the spotlight had found him, whether he wanted it or not. That night alone in a London hotel room, he watched himself from a stranger's phone. Not the way he felt in the moment, measured, deliberate, restrained, but the way others now saw him, heroic, stoic, trailblazing. It was surreal. He scrolled through the comments. This man just redefined professionalism. Why do black folks always have to be the calm ones? Imagine staying that composed after being called boy. Incredible. Give this man a medal and a raise. You can't tell me this isn't what black excellence looks like. But not all the comments were kind. Some accused him of exaggerating. Others said he should have just moved. One wrote, "I don't care who he is. If she paid for first class, she has a right to feel uncomfortable." And there it was, the twist of the knife, that familiar echo of justification, of people defending bad behavior because it came from someone they relate to. Because deep down, they'd rather preserve comfort than confront truth. Going viral had given Marcus a voice, but it had also made him a target. He started getting strange emails, blocked calls, a message that read, "Stay quiet." You've made your point. Don't push further. And perhaps most unsettling, his employer called a mandatory meeting in London, with senior executives flying in early. That's the other thing about going viral. It doesn't just make you visible, it makes you vulnerable. Visibility is powerful, but it's also risky. You don't always get to choose how the world sees you once the camera is rolling. And for people of color in positions of leadership, being seen doesn't always mean being understood. But Marcus knew something else too. If a moment of quiet defiance could spark this much noise, maybe just maybe it was time to stop surviving inside the system and start changing it. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, embossed. It sat on the conference table like a secret everyone knew, but no one wanted to say aloud. Marcus didn't open it. He didn't need to. He already knew what it said. Earlier that morning, he'd been escorted quietly but firmly into a meeting room at Atlantic Airways' London office. The kind of room with tall windows, minimalist furniture, and an air of quiet calculation. The CEO was there. So was the senior VP of operations, and a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself simply as legal counsel. They got to the point quickly. "We'd like to resolve this matter discreetly," they said. Discreetly. That word did a lot of work. It meant we know what happened was wrong, but we'd rather not deal with it. We're not asking you to lie. Just not to tell the whole truth. Here's a number, enough to make the memory go away. $7 million. No admission of guilt, no public apology, just a statement from Marcus saying the incident had been misunderstood, that he bore no ill will toward Ms. Whitmore or Atlantic Airways. In exchange, early retirement, full benefits, and a silence wrapped in legal language. Marcus sat there listening, watching. He could hear his own heartbeat. Not from excitement, but from weight. The weight of what $7 million could do. Pay off the mortgage. Cover his daughter's tuition, grad school even. Move Sharon's mother into a private care home. Take his family on the kind of vacations they'd only talked about in passing. He could walk away from the cockpit, buy a boat, disappear, all for staying quiet. But here's the thing, dignity doesn't come with a price tag. Not a real one. And if it ever does, it's not dignity anymore. It's a transaction. Marcus thought of every black pilot who'd smiled through insult, every flight attendant who'd been called the help, every mechanic who'd been ignored, every gate agent who'd been doubted. He thought of Tyler, the little boy from the gate area, and what it would mean if Marcus said yes. You can be anything, but only if you don't speak up. And most of all, he thought of Kesa, his daughter, the one who'd watched her father live with integrity his whole life, the one who'd called him crying when the video hit her campus. What would it mean to teach her that silence buys safety, but truth might cost you everything? You see, $7 million can buy comfort, but it can't buy clarity. And clarity, once you've felt, it is hard to let go of. So Marcus slid the envelope back across the table. "No," he said softly. "Thank you, but no." The room froze. "I won't lie for you. I won't disappear for your convenience. And I won't teach my daughter that dignity is negotiable." He stood, smoothed his uniform jacket, and walked out, head high, soul intact. There are moments when saying no costs more than you can afford, but saying yes costs who you are. Marcus didn't know what came next. Would there be retaliation, lawsuits, career sabotage? Maybe, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of losing everything, because he'd finally stopped losing himself. And as it turns out, saying no to the money was saying yes to something far greater. When Marcus got back to his hotel room, he didn't say anything. Not right away. He just sat on the edge of the bed, uniform, still crisp shoes, still damp from the champagne that had long since dried. The envelope was gone, but the weight of the decision lingered. That night he called Sharon. She didn't ask how the meeting went. She already knew. There was a pause between them, the kind that only happens between people who've carried the same dreams for decades. She broke the silence first. "Did you take it?" "No," he said. Another pause. Then I figured, I just wanted to hear you say it. They didn't talk about the bills or the repairs the house still needed, or the final tuition payment due next semester. They talked about Kesa, how she was holding up under the media attention, how she wanted to speak out on her campus but wasn't sure if that would help or make things worse. "She's proud of you," Sharon said. "And scared. Same as me. And that's the tension, isn't it? Legacy versus livelihood. What you build with your hands versus what you build with your values. One puts food on the table, the other puts meaning on the map. It's a choice most people don't have to make because for many those two things align. But for people like Marcus, for those who carry a story that doesn't always fit the mold, the two often pull in opposite directions. He could have taken the deal, retired early, quietly, no shame in that. Many would have understood. But Marcus knew his daughter was watching. Not just as a daughter, but as a young black woman entering a world where the cost of silence had always been paid in full by her ancestors. And if he taught her that the best way forward was to bend, what would that say about everything they'd taught her to believe this wasn't just about money anymore? It was about legacy. Not the kind carved into headstones or hung in boardrooms, but the kind whispered from father to daughter, passed in quiet courage, etched into memory through the choices we make when no one else is watching. Marcus remembered something his own father once told him. Your name is more than a word, son. It's a promise. Don't ever give it away cheap. He hadn't thought about that in years, until now. Livelihood sustains you. Legacy shapes who you become. And sometimes, you have to risk one to protect the other. The next morning, Marcus packed his flight bag. The uniform went on just like it always had. Except this time, he didn't just feel like a pilot. He felt like a man who had drawn a line. And now it was time to see who would try to cross it. Marcus always believed the cockpit was the most honest place on Earth. There were no politics at 38,000 feet, no spin, no games, just physics, wind fuel, and truth. Either the aircraft flew or it didn't. Either you followed the checklist or you didn't. And every decision had consequences that showed up immediately. But what he was learning now was that down here on the ground, truth didn't always get to take off. The call came from Robert, his brother-in-law. A respected financial investigator with the SEC, Robert had seen his fair share of corporate manipulation. But this time, it was personal. You remember that investment deal Whitmore Pharmaceuticals was trying to push through the airline's pension fund? Marcus nodded, staring out the hotel window. Yeah, big returns. Too good to be true. Exactly. That's because it is. Robert explained that for over a year, the SEC had been building a case against Whitmore. Allegations of price-fixing, falsified clinical trial data, and backdoor lobbying. But every time they got close, someone inside leaked their strategy. And recently, those leaks had led to one place: Atlantic Airways boardroom, specifically the Pension Investment Committee. The same committee where Marcus, thanks to his seniority and financial training, served as one of 5 trustees. It hit him like a cold draft. The video, the settlement offer, the sudden pressure to stay quiet. It wasn't just about protecting the airline's reputation. It was about protecting something much bigger. He wasn't the threat because he stood up to a racist passenger. He was the threat because he now stood between powerful people and a $120 million investment meant to launder the fallout of a federal investigation. And he hadn't even known it, not when Patricia threw the champagne, not when the CEO offered hush money, not even when the cameras turned on. But now he did, and that changed everything. Because Marcus wasn't just a black pilot in first class anymore. He was a man sitting in a boardroom with access to confidential investment data, a man who could vote yes or no on a deal that might bankrupt a fund meant to protect the retirement of every employee he'd ever worked alongside, from flight attendants, to mechanics, to janitors, to gate agents. The very people Patricia had looked down on Marcus was now being asked to betray. This wasn't just corporate greed. It was corruption, wearing polished shoes and tailored suits, smiling for press releases while quietly robbing the people who made the airline run. And it wasn't coming from the outside. It was coming from within. Not all villains wear masks. Sometimes they wear lapel pins. And the most dangerous ones are those who smile while asking you to look the other way. Marcus knew what had to happen next. He needed to go back to the boardroom, back to the people who thought he'd fold. And this time, he wouldn't be asking questions. He'd be demanding answers. The morning after the call with Robert, Marcus boarded his scheduled flight back to Atlanta, this time as pilot in command. His hands moved instinctively through the pre-flight checklist, but his mind was elsewhere. There were threats to his family, corruption inside the company, a pension fund at risk, and a vote looming just days away that could either stop the fraud or seal it. But for the next 8 hours, Marcus had one job: fly the plane. His first officer that day was Jennifer Reeves, a young, sharp white woman, preparing for her own captain's certification. She'd seen the video. Of course she had. Everyone had. But when she spoke, her words were simple. My daughter saw it, asked me if that really happens to pilots. I told her yes, but I also got to tell her someone finally said no. Marcus didn't say much in return. He didn't need to. Sometimes the truth just sits there in the air between two people unspoken, but understood. Cruising at 30,000 feet as the clouds drifted silently below, he thought about how strange it was. Up here, he was always trusted, always in control. Passengers never questioned who was flying the plane. They didn't see his face, just heard his voice. And that voice, calm, measured, professional, gave them peace. Down there on the ground, the same voice, same man was doubted, questioned, reduced. Why? Because down there, people saw color before they saw competence. But up here, race couldn't land a plane, and neither could prejudice. Only skill could. During descent, he noticed a small face peeking through the curtain near business class. Tyler, the little boy from the gate a few days earlier. The one who'd asked if he could be a pilot too. Marcus smiled. Tyler's mom, Denise, mouthed thank you from her seat. After landing, as passengers began to deplane, Tyler approached the cockpit holding a folded piece of paper, a crayon drawing of a plane. On the side, in blocky handwriting, it read, Captain Marcus. For being brave, Tyler said softly. Mom says that's what heroes do. Marcus knelt down. Your mom is right, but real bravery, it's doing the right thing. Even when it's scary. He handed Tyler his spare pair of pilot wings. Hold on to these. Someday they might be yours for real. And in that moment, something shifted inside Marcus. He realized this fight wasn't just about exposing corruption or refusing hush money or protecting retirements. It was about that boy and every child like him. Representation isn't about ego. It's about evidence, proof that you can belong where history says you don't, that someone like you has been there and made it and held the door open for whoever comes next. When you're the first or the only, you carry more than your own dreams. You carry proof for someone else's. As Marcus stepped off the plane, he didn't just feel like a pilot anymore. He felt like something more, a bridge between what was and what could be. And he knew that bridge would be tested soon, because next came the vote, the boardroom, the moment when all the hidden truths would have to face daylight. The boardroom sat on the 30th floor of Atlantic Airways headquarters, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a sweeping view of downtown Atlanta. But Marcus wasn't looking out the window. He was looking across the table at 5 other faces. Familiar, experienced, powerful, and possibly compromised. This was it. The vote on the Whitmore Pharmaceuticals investment proposal. $120 million, a promised return large enough to secure the airline's pension fund for decades if the numbers were real. But Marcus knew they weren't. He had the proof: financial inconsistencies, offshore accounts, a trail of doctored trial results. And he also knew at least one person at this very table had helped cover it up. He cleared his throat. Before we vote, he began, I'd like to request full access to the source documents, not just the summary. A pause. Margaret Chen's fingers tapped her pen against the table. Captain Thompson, the analysts have already, I trust, Marcus said evenly, but I verify. Elizabeth Hartley, the oldest trustee, a retired pilot with white hair and steady eyes, nodded slowly. I support that. Franklin Torres, the union rep, shifted in his seat. David Morrison, the CEO, remained silent, watching Marcus like a man reading a thread in real time. The room grew colder, but Marcus didn't back down. He laid the documents on the table, outlined the inconsistencies, mentioned the federal investigation, said the quiet parts out loud. And when he finished, he looked around the table again. There was silence. Long, thick, uncomfortable. But then Elizabeth spoke. He's right. These numbers don't add up. I say we delay the vote. And slowly, one by one, others began to nod. Even Franklin, even David grudgingly. It had taken weeks of being alone, of being doubted, threatened, tested, but now someone else was finally standing too. That's the thing about courage. It's contagious, but someone has to go first. And when that someone refuses to shrink, when they speak calmly in the face of pressure, stand upright in the face of power, and tell the truth without blinking, it gives the people around them permission to do the same. Marcus had gone first, But now he wasn't alone. Not in the boardroom, not online, not in the union halls, not in the comments from ground crews, pilots, attendants, engineers, all saying the same thing. Finally, someone stood up. Change doesn't begin when the crowd speaks. It begins when one person refuses to be silent. And when that happens, others find their voices too. But the fight wasn't over. The vote had been delayed, the corruption exposed, but the damage still had to be confronted and trust had to be rebuilt. There was still more truth to bring to light, more accountability to demand. And in the midst of all that, Marcus got a call, a name he hadn't seen on his screen since this all began. The name on the caller ID made Marcus pause. Patricia Whitmore. He hadn't heard her voice since the day she shattered that champagne flute at his feet and tried to shatter his dignity along with it. He could have ignored the call, but something told him not to. So he answered. Her tone was different now. Gone was the polished certainty, the sharp entitlement. In its place, something quieter, exhausted, human. Captain Thompson, she began. I've been watching the news. I've seen what's happened, so have a lot of people, he replied gently. She paused. Then I want to testify. Everything I know about the company, about what my husband's board has been doing. It was wrong. I was wrong. I'm sorry. There was a long silence. Not because Marcus didn't believe in redemption, but because real apologies take time to land. And sometimes the people who need to say them are also the ones who need most to hear themselves say it out loud, before they can change. In the months that followed, the dominoes began to fall. The fraudulent investment proposal was withdrawn. Key executives were indicted. The pension fund was protected. But more than that, something deeper shifted. Atlantic Airways implemented new policies. Bias training went beyond corporate checkbox exercises. A scholarship fund was launched for underrepresented youth pursuing careers in aviation. The first recipient, Tyler, the little boy with the drawing that said Captain Marcus. He stood on stage in a blazer 3 sizes too big, grinning as he held up his certificate. When asked what he wanted to be, he said, a pilot, like the one who didn't let anyone tell him to leave. And Jasmine Washington, another scholarship recipient, became the first Black woman to complete Atlantic's new pilot training program. Her first commercial flight co-piloting next to Marcus. Thank you, she whispered during final checks. Not just for the scholarship, for proving we belong. He smiled. You always did. The rest of the world's just catching up. That's what dignity leaves behind. Not applause, not fame, but room. Room for others to stand taller, to enter spaces with less fear, to look up at the sky and think, if he made it, maybe I can too. Marcus never wanted to be a symbol. He just wanted to fly. But when the world asked him to shrink, he stood. And because he stood, others followed. The fight for dignity isn't about one moment. It's about what that moment unlocks. For you, for others, for the future. That flight, the one with the shattered glass and the stunned silence, might have ended in London, but its impact still ascending. And now as Marcus straps in for another flight, a new generation in the cockpit beside him, and the sky stretched wide ahead, he knows he didn't just survive injustice, he transformed it into policy, into progress, into possibility. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of a time you stood up or a time you wished you had, if it made you think of someone who quietly carries the weight of being the first or the only, or the one who always has to smile through it, then don't let the moment end here. Leave a comment. Share this video. Tell us where you're watching from and what dignity means to you. Because stories like Marcus's, they don't just belong in headlines. They belong in hearts and in history. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a perfect time to join a community that believes in courage and change and in people who quietly refuse to sit in the wrong seat just because someone else said so. Thank you for flying with us today, and remember your voice matters, your presence matters, and sometimes one quiet act of courage is all it takes to help others rise.